Imagine waking up one day and discovering that, on paper, you never existed. Your birth certificate is missing. Your school records are gone. Old photographs where you clearly remember standing with your classmates now show only empty space where your body used to be. The faces around you look the same, but in their eyes there is a strange hesitation, as if they are no longer sure you were ever really there. In the late Soviet Union, this was not just a nightmare. It was a method of control, refined over decades, turned into something that witnesses would later describe as a machine for erasing human lives from reality. Long before anyone whispered about secret laboratories or underground complexes, the Soviet state had already learned how to make people disappear. It did not always mean killing them. Sometimes it meant moving them to a distant camp, changing their name in the internal files, and adjusting the story so no one asked questions. An inconvenient official might suffer a sudden transfer. A scientist who knew too much might be sent to a remote institute with no visitors allowed. Their families would receive vague letters stamped with official seals, and eventually those letters would stop coming. The body remained alive, somewhere out there in the snow and concrete. But their public existence, their role in the story of the country, was quietly deleted. Control over memory was one of the state's most powerful weapons. The authorities did not need to argue with citizens about what was true if they could simply remove the evidence. Photographs were retouched to remove disgraced figures. Entire paragraphs vanished from old encyclopedia entries when someone fell out of favor. A person could be present in thousands of documents one year and in almost none the next. For most citizens, these changes were invisible. They never saw the original version. They only saw the reality that the archives allowed them to see. Over time, this practice evolved from chaotic repression into something colder and more systematic. Hidden among ordinary ministries and harmless-sounding departments, there were offices whose sole purpose was to handle problematic information. Their job was not to produce propaganda posters or triumphant news articles. Their job was to find the cracks in the story and seal them. They identified people who knew too much, documents that did not fit the official line, and traces of events that were never supposed to have happened. When these offices moved, they left almost nothing behind. A metal cabinet, a broken typewriter, and a thick dust of shredded paper. From fragments of testimony, from half-burned memoranda and surviving rumors, a disturbing picture begins to form. Somewhere in this invisible bureaucracy, in the late period of the Soviet Union, a special project was created. It did not appear under a dramatic title. It hid behind vague phrases about information security and archival optimization. Internally, some of those who worked around it began to use another name. They called it Block 13. To them, it felt less like an office and more like a machine. A complex system with many parts that, once activated, processed a human life until almost no trace of it was left. The machine was not a single device humming in a basement. It was a chain of people, tools, and procedures stretched across the entire state. The process began long before anyone knocked on a target's door. First, clerks inside distant buildings were instructed to clarify certain files. A birth record would be quietly pulled and set aside. A housing registry entry would be marked for correction. Somewhere else, an officer would request permission to access personal correspondence or medical histories. None of these actions looked suspicious by themselves. But together, they formed the first turn of the gear. Once a person was selected by Block 13, every part of their paper identity became vulnerable. Work records were rewritten so that projects were assigned to different names. Academic theses were recatalogued under altered titles. In some cases, copies of documents were deliberately misfiled in faraway regions, where no one would ever think to search. The goal was not only to destroy evidence but to scatter it, to bury it under an ocean of unrelated papers so deep that even a determined investigator would drown in the search. Photographs formed a separate battlefield. Group portraits in factories, institutes, or party meetings were considered dangerous if they showed people who had become politically inconvenient. Technicians were ordered to retouch these images, carefully removing entire bodies, filling the space with curtains, flags, or empty wall. Families whose relatives were under suspicion sometimes received sudden visits. Officials would explain that certain photo albums needed to be temporarily confiscated for state reasons. Many of these albums never returned. Generations later, descendants would open dusty boxes and find only a few safe, harmless images, as if their ancestor had simply avoided every camera in existence. But the machine did not stop with paper and film. It also targeted living memory. People who had known the target well were quietly approached. Some were reminded of their own vulnerable secrets and encouraged to be careful about what they said. Others were told fabricated stories. That the missing person had committed a terrible crime, that they had betrayed the country, that speaking of them could attract dangerous attention. Over time, friends and colleagues learned to edit their own recollections. They stopped mentioning the person's name in public. Then in private. Then even in their own thoughts, fearfully pushing the memory away like a dangerous object. In this way, Block 13 measured an unsettling idea. How much of a human being exists only in records and in the minds of others? If you cut away the documents and frighten the witnesses into silence, what is left? A body locked behind barbed wire in a camp no one can find on a map? A few fading impressions in the dreams of people who are too afraid to speak? The project reportedly tracked how long small pieces of information survived. How many months before a neighbor forgot the exact apartment number? How many years before even family members stopped questioning why no official trace remained? Some of the earliest known targets of this system were not famous dissidents, but people the state considered expendable. There are stories of low-rank technicians who handled sensitive equipment, anonymous archivists who glanced at the wrong file, or drivers who overheard a conversation they were never meant to hear. One day they left for work and did not return. Authorities might tell relatives that the person had been transferred, or that they had chosen to move away for personal reasons. When the family tried to confirm this, the offices they contacted could find nothing. No transfer order. No forwarding address. No acknowledgement that the person had ever held an official position at all. Imagine standing in a corridor of a government building, holding a crumpled photograph of your brother or sister, trying to explain to a bored clerk that this person existed. The clerk types the name and shrugs. No results. You show an old letter with a stamp from a factory. The factory reports that no such employee was ever on their list. You ask to check archive cards, and the archivist politely explains that some records were recently reorganized, which might account for the confusion. Every answer is calm. Every answer is reasonable. And every answer pushes you deeper into doubt. Did you misremember the dates? Did you imagine some of these details? How do you prove that you are not the crazy one? The legend of the Soviet machine that erased people from reality grows in these empty spaces. It is fed by missing files, altered photographs, and those rare, fragile testimonies from survivors who insist that somewhere, in the folds of the collapsing Soviet system, there was a project dedicated not to studying weapons or rockets, but to perfecting the destruction of personal existence. According to them, this machine did not need electricity or gears. Its true power came from something far more frightening. The state's absolute control over what was written, what was remembered, and what was allowed to be real. Today, when old archives are slowly opened and dusty rooms are finally unlocked, researchers sometimes encounter gaps that cannot be explained by normal chaos or incompetence. Whole series of documents end in the middle of a sentence. Lists jump from one number to another, skipping names with surgical precision. Photo collections from certain years show the same events again and again, but always from angles that avoid particular faces. It is as if someone carefully cut away specific lives from the film of history and then tried to smooth the edges so no one would notice. We may never know how many people were processed through this invisible machine. For each confirmed case, there could be dozens who left behind nothing but a feeling of absence, a sense that something is missing from the story. Yet the idea itself is terrifying enough. In a world where governments, corporations, and algorithms still control what is stored and what is forgotten, the ghost of Block 13 feels disturbingly modern. If a state once tried to erase people by controlling paper and celluloid, what might be possible now, in an age when our entire lives are reduced to digital records that can be edited with a few silent keystrokes?